What's a nuclear attack? What is it? Well, unlike a dirty bomb, which disperses radioactive material using conventional explosives, a nuclear attack is the use of a device that produces a nuclear explosion. A nuclear explosion is caused by an uncontrolled chain reaction that splits atomic nuclei, or fission, to produce an intense wave of heat, light, air pressure, and radiation, followed by the production and release of radioactive particles. For ground blast, these radioactive particles are drawn up into a mushroom cloud, with dust and debris producing fallout that can expose people at great distances to radiation. Now let's talk about nuclear devices. Traditional Cold War concerns were focused on the possible use of military nuclear weapons. A nuclear terrorist attack might be carried out with an improvised nuclear device, or an IND, which is a crude nuclear device built from the components of a stolen weapon, or from scratch using nuclear material such as plutonium or highly enriched uranium. Now, what about the access and use of nuclear materials or weapons? Well, the primary obstacle to a nuclear attack is limited access to weapon-grade nuclear materials. Highly enriched uranium, plutonium, and stockpiled weapons are carefully inventoried and guarded. Nuclear attack is also impeded because building nuclear weapons is difficult. General principles are available in open literature, of course, but constructing a workable device requires advanced technical knowledge in areas such as nuclear physics and materials science. Of course, crude nuclear weapons are typically very heavy, ranging from a few hundred pounds to several tons, and are very difficult to transport, especially by air. Specially designed small nuclear weapons, including the so-called suitcase nuclear weapons, are much lighter, but they're difficult to acquire and to construct. Okay, what is the impact of a nuclear attack? A nuclear attack could and will cause substantial fatalities, injuries, and infrastructure damage from the heat and blast of the explosion, and significant radiological consequences from both the initial nuclear radiation and the radioactive fallout that settles over the initial event. An electromagnetic pulse from the explosion could also disrupt telecommunications and power distribution. The energy released by a nuclear explosion is distributed roughly as 50% shock waves, 35% heat, 5% initial nuclear radiation, and 10% fallout radiation. The distribution varies depending on the design of the weapon and the altitude of the explosion. And what about the size of nuclear explosions? Nuclear explosions are classified based on the amount of energy they produce, or otherwise known as the yield. A nuclear attack by terrorists, as an example, would be expected to have a yield of less than 1 to several kilotons. A kiloton is not the weight of the bomb, but rather the equivalent energy of an amount of the explosion. TNT, or 1 kiloton, equals 1,000 tons of TNT. Large military nuclear weapons are in the megaton range. What about areas that are affected by this? Well, the area affected depends on the yield of the nuclear device, the topography at the explosion site, the buildings, geological structures, the altitude of the explosion, and weather conditions. The range of significant effects can vary. The general pattern of damage also can vary. Now, with initial effects, or what are also known as the prompt effects of nuclear explosion, you'll have shock waves, thermal or heat energy, and initial radiation. And these cover an approximately circular area that will create all of this devastation. The effects decrease with the distance from what is known as ground zero, where the bomb explodes. For nuclear devices with a higher yield, heat damage becomes the primary initial effect of concern, and it eclipses both the damage from the shock wave and the initial radiation. Something to be concerned about, certainly. Radioactive fallout spreads in an irregular or an elliptical pattern in the direction that the wind blows. The most dangerous fallout would occur near the explosion site within minutes of the explosion. But fallout carrying lethal radiation doses could be deposited several miles away. Don't forget this. Fallout could potentially travel hundreds of miles, but its concentration of radiation dose decreases as it spreads and as time passes. Now, what about secondary hazards from a nuclear explosion? Well, the intense heat of the nuclear explosion will produce fires throughout the immediate blast zone. You can have damaged buildings, downed power and phone lines, leaking gas lines, broken water mains, and damaged roads, bridges, and tunnels. They're all going to be affected. And very, very hazardous conditions are going to exist as a result of this. The detonation also produces an electromagnetic pulse, something known as EMP, that knocks out electronic equipment. Well, what about the persistence of radiation levels? How long do they last? What goes on? The mixture of radioactive elements formed in a nuclear explosion is so complex, with both short and long-lasting isotopes, that radioactive decay can only be estimated. During the first hour after a nuclear explosion, radioactivity levels drop precipitously. Radioactivity levels are further reduced by about 90% after another 7 hours, and by about 99% after 2 days. So what is the danger? Well, the number and type of fatalities and injuries depend on many factors, including the yield of the nuclear device, the population near the site of the explosion, and in the fallout path and weather conditions. Even a partial nuclear detonation could produce many casualties in a densely populated area. An extensive weapons effect testing program and studies of the 1945 bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki provide what we know about the effects of nuclear explosions. What about some health effects from shock wave and thermal energy? Well, fatalities and injuries will result from the pressure of the shock wave, bodies being thrown, falling buildings, and flying debris. The thermal, the heat energy, including this fireball that is a result of this bomb, will cause fatalities and severe burns to the skin and to the eyes. What about the health effects from radiation? Well, people who survive the physical shock wave and heat may suffer health effects from radiation. The health effects of radiation depend on what? They depend upon the amount of radiation absorbed by the body, or the dose measured in units called rads, the type of radiation, the route of exposure absorbed by the body, inhaled or ingested, the length of time that you were exposed to it. Well, if a reasonable estimate can be made of a person's dose, health effects at that dose can be predicted with pretty good accuracy. These are both short and long-term effects of radiation. Well, what about these short-term effects? Well, acute radiation syndrome, or otherwise known as ARS, may develop in those who are exposed to radiation levels of 50 to 100 rad, depending on the type of radiation and the individual. Symptoms of ARS include nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and reduced blood cell counts. Radiation, especially beta radiation, can also cause skin burns and localized injury. Fatalities begin to appear at exposures of 125 rad and at doses between 300 to 400 rad. About half of those exposed will die without supportive treatment. At very high doses, greater than 1,000 rad, people can die within hours or days due to effects on the central nervous system. Radiation exposure inhibits stem cell growth. For those who depend, they will die within weeks to months, and death is usually caused by damage to gastrointestinal lining, the bone marrow, where stem cell growth is crucial, and other factors. Fetuses are also more sensitive to radiation. The effects include growth retardation, malfunctions, or impaired brain functioning. It's pretty serious. So What about the long-term effects? Well, radiation exposure increases the risk of developing cancer, including leukemia, in later in life. The increased cancer risk is proportional to the radiation dose. The survivors of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki atomic bombs have about a 10% increased risk of developing cancers over normal age-specific rates, some occurring more than 50 years following the exposure. 50 years after the exposure. Can you believe that? A long-term medical surveillance program would likely be established to monitor potential health effects of survivors of nuclear attack. There is no evidence of genetic changes in survivors, children, who were conceived and born after the bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So what should you do to protect yourself? Well, there are three basic ways people can reduce exposure to radiation: through time, distance, and shielding. With time, decrease the amount of time spent in areas where there is radiation. That's a must. And what about distance? Well, you have to increase your distance from a radiation source. Doubling your distance from a potent source divides the distance of the dose by 4. If sheltered in a contaminated area, keep your distance from exterior walls and roofs. What about shielding? You have to create a barrier between yourself and the radiation source with a building or vehicle. Buildings, especially those made of brick or concrete, provide considerable shielding from radiation. Exposure is reduced by about 50% inside a one-story building and by about 90% at a level below ground. So what about some practical steps to this? Well, if there is an advanced warning of an impending nuclear attack, people should listen to authorities about whether to evacuate the area or to seek shelter underground as soon as possible. If you live outside, or if you happen to be outside when a blast occurs, here's some things you have to do. You have to lie face down on the ground and protect your exposed skin. You have to place your hands under your body. Remain flat until the heat and shock waves have passed by. Cover your mouth and nose with a cloth to filter all the particles from the inhaled air. You need to evacuate immediately. Find a shelter if you can. With evacuation, if a cloud of debris is moving toward you, you have to leave the area by a route perpendicular to the path of fallout. Move along away from it. If a cloud is not visible or the direction of the fallout is unknown, seek shelter, a basement, or the center of a high-rise building away from windows or doors. Those are the best options for you. If you were possibly exposed to contamination, dust, and debris, you have to get rid of your outer clothing as soon as you can. If possible, you need to shower, wash your hair, change your clothes before entering a shelter immediately. Do not scrub harshly or scratch your skin. You have to listen to information from emergency responders and your authorities. If you're sheltering in place, you have to get as far below ground as possible. Shut off ventilation systems and seal doors and windows until the fallout cloud has passed, generally over a matter of hours. You have to stay inside until authorities say it's safe to come outside. You have to have stored food and drinking water. And you have to listen to local radio or TV for official information. Broadcast might be disrupted for some time as a result of the power outages from the result of the radioactivity and the electromagnetic impulses. If you happen to be in the path of the fallout, if you've survived the initial effects of the explosion, protection from fallout radiation is the most important life-saving measure. Because the material can travel high into the atmosphere, the fallout dispersal pattern cannot be accurately predicted using surface winds. Authorities will advise people to either shelter in place or to evacuate. You have to listen to information about evacuation routes, temporary shelters, and procedures. If there is time before evacuating, you have to close and lock the windows and doors in your home. Turn off all the air conditioning, vents, fans, furnace to keep all the radioactive material from being sucked inside of your home. What about medical treatment? Well, medical treatment will be provided to people with burns and injuries and to those suffering from radiation sickness. It's a must. Treatment for acute radiation syndrome would include the prevention and treatment of infections, stem cell and platelet transfusions, psychological support, all the careful observations made of skin injury, weight loss, and fever, all of these things. Exposed and contaminated people can be safely handled by trained responders and medical personnel. If people ingest or inhale fallout, treatment could include the use of various diluting or mobilizing agents that help rid the body of radioactive elements. Potassium iodide, or KI pills as they're known, are not a general cure-all. They're only effective in blocking the uptake or inhaled or ingested radioactive iodine into the thyroid gland if taken before or just after inhalation or ingestion. Radioactive iodine can cause thyroid cancer and disease. So what are the long-term consequences of the exposure? Well, you have to monitor and clean up the affected areas first. Most of the fallout would dissipate after a few weeks to months. Cleanup activities would focus on areas near ground zero contaminated with long-lasting radioactive isotopes such as certain plutonium and uranium isotopes. These are temporary measures that can be taken to fix radioactive materials in place and stop the spread of contamination. These include fixative sprays such as flour and water mixtures, road oil, or water that can be used to wet ground surfaces. In the days and weeks following the attack, officials might be expected to do what? Well, one, they'll establish a plan for careful monitoring and assessment of affected areas. Two, they'll impose quarantines on contaminated areas as necessary to prevent further exposures. Three, they'll remove contamination from areas where people might continue to be exposed. And four, keep citizens informed about the situation. So what about the control of contaminated food supplies? That's something else you absolutely have to be aware of. Public health officials should be able to identify contaminated water and food such as milk and produce and replace them with clean food from outside the area. Okay, something else you have to consider is the economic impact of this. Economic impacts would result from deaths, illnesses, loss of jobs, destruction of workplaces and homes. Increased government spending and stock market swings could significantly impact the national economy. The cleanup, the rebuilding and replacement of lost property and goods could cost many billions of dollars. Local economic impacts could continue even after the site has been cleaned up if people are reluctant to return to the affected area. What about the psychological impacts? Well, the psychological impacts of nuclear attack will vary. Most individuals will prove resilient. Some will experience absolutely extraordinary post-traumatic chronic distress and fear, long-lasting. Many of those who were or believe they were exposed will likely worry about delayed radiation health effects and the future probability of developing cancer. Depending on how the attack evolves and its aftermath is handled, there may be a loss of confidence in societal institutions. If severe damage to the communications network disrupts communication from authorities, public anxiety and fear could be heightened. Please listen to these things. Remember what I said and be careful. Take care of yourself. We're in an extremely dangerous time of our lives now. And the possibility of nuclear warfare has never been more real than it is now.